Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we're going to be visiting with a perspective of God and reality that Christian Science open up as one that offers freedom for whatever in our lives seems painful, debilitating, or limiting. We're also going to learn how Mary Baker Eddy's discovery in the 19th century is still relevant to our lives today because of what it reveals about God's great love for each of us and its powerful life-transforming effects. One particular patient that's joining us here on the program today had this in his own life. He needed to share it with others dealing with similar mindsets of discouragement. He said from a certain moment he knew that he had found something very special and could hardly wait to explain this experience to others, this ability to love and be loved by God, he says. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, and we're going to be talking about a new view of God and its effect on well-being. I'd like to welcome Mr. Philip Hockley to the Beyond 50 radio program. Philip, thank you for being on the program today.
Oh, good morning, Daniel. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Now, I understand that as a registered handicapped person that you're going to be talking about this, and what were the things that you were handicapped with that, as I understand, you were healed from?
Yeah, correct. And it's quite right that we should define what the handicaps are, because I know that it can mean different things to different people. So the handicaps that I had on the night of the lecture, the most serious one was my weight loss. I had had unresolved stomach conditions, which had led me to become allergic to all kinds of foods. So my usual body weight as an adult is about 185 pounds. On the night of the lecture, after almost a decade of losing weight continually, I was only 105 pounds. So that was the most critical of the challenges I was facing. But on top of that, I'd had an episode of arthritis as a young boy, which left one leg shorter than the other, called a leg length discrepancy. That in turn caused my spine to curve, called a scoliosis, and that scoliosis had really gone pretty much unnoticed for many years. I was an active sports person. I kind of just got on with it, you know. I wasn't into self-pity. I just made the best of it. But when I was losing body weight, those weakening muscles and deteriorating muscles started to let me have a lot of problems with my neck starting to dislocate and lock very painfully, because we also realized that there was an imbalance in the neck that hadn't really been discovered until I started losing weight. So at the time of the lecture, I was in a pretty miserable state, I must say.
Well, I can imagine that you would be. What do you think was going on there that things changed for you?
Well, I was in a different mindset than I'd been in at the time of the lecture, because when I was told by the doctors that I was incurable, I kind of rose in rebellion. And I thought, well, no, I'll go out and I'll find the cure some other way. So then I went out and I tried all the alternative therapies. I literally went from the A to Z, from acupuncture all the way through to zone therapy. So I tried every known alternative. Still I wasn't improved. Then, out of sheer desperation, and I really mean sheer desperation, I reached out to the local Christian churches. Now, the reason why I call this a desperate act is, as a little boy, I'd had some very painful experiences at the hands of people who called themselves Christians, even though now I realize they were not acting like it, but they called themselves Christians. So ever since I was a little boy, Christians to me, I would want to just back off from. I wanted to recoil, you know. So in this moment of sheer desperation, it looks like I'm facing an early grave. I reached out to all the local churches and asked them to pray for me, and all of them did, and still I wasn't healed. This was about 2 years prior to me coming to the lecture. It looks like I've exhausted every possible human remedy, and I'm literally now just having to prepare for the inevitable early death. So I went to learn to meditate so that I could be at peace while facing this early grave. And I started practicing a type of mindful meditation, which allowed me to feel all the discomfort in the body, but not to react to it mentally. And what I found was my mental peace was established even though the body was still breaking down and in tremendous pain. So I was in a very peaceful state of mind before I came to the lecture.
So did you come to the conclusion possibly that it was your mindset that moved you into this particular place physically?
Well, I think being very peaceful and very quiet. I was sitting in one seat all day long. I couldn't move or walk very far. I was just sitting there kind of contemplating life and trying to think a little bit about what God might look like when I get to meet him. Because at that point in my life, I thought God was way off up beyond the clouds. And I thought, right, well, if I'm going to die, I'm going to meet God probably, so I should probably try and be polite and know what he looks like. So I was just thinking about what I'd heard about God from other sources than Christianity, because I still wasn't interested in Christianity one single bit. I still was very bitter and hurt by that very early childhood experience. So I was looking into things like the lives of really wonderful, inspiring characters like Mahatma Gandhi. I was looking into Mother Teresa. I was looking into people like Florence Nightingale, who sacrificed so much of herself to help those in need. So I was trying to find some kind of information about God, but I certainly wasn't going to go to the Bible or to the Christians anymore. That's for certain.
Did you find that because you made that decision that and not going that direction, what was it about that made you feel like, well, I don't want to go this way, but I'll maybe take a look at going this way instead?
Well, all that happened, in fact, was I saw a poster which was advertising this lecture that I attended. And the title of the lecture was this: Mary Baker Eddy, a remarkable lady of the 19th century. Now, I had been, in an earlier part of my life, I'd been a history major in college. And I had been very interested in history and world history. So because I'd never heard of this person before, and all I knew was she was from the 19th century, I presumed that it was a history lecture. So I went to this lecture quite literally, not knowing that it was sponsored by a local branch of the Christian Science Church in that city, and I had no idea they were going to be talking from the Bible, and no idea that they expect people to find healing in the teachings of Christian Science and studying the Bible. I had no idea about this at all. So I was a completely blank slate when I got to that lecture. No expectations whatsoever.
Now, what was surprising as you picked up or went to this lecture that you discovered?
So what was really, this is a really pivotal moment for me. When they started talking about that night's event was going to be based on the healing message of God's great love as found in the Bible, I mean, my human reaction was not pleasant. I was really not happy with the fact that I've got to this place, and I've now discovered it's not a history lecture per se. It is historical, yes, because it talks about the life and times of Mrs. Eddy and her discovery, but it was based on the Bible. So I immediately my heart sank, and I thought, oh my goodness, they're Christians. And I just didn't want to be there. So while I'm having all this kind of human opinion and human judgment about this event, I just started noticing something change in my thinking, which I had never experienced before in my life. And the way that I described it after the event was like this. If you imagine that you're inside an enclosed space with 4 walls and a roof, that's a limited, confined space. Imagine if you were to take a zipper and unzip the roof of that room, and you open the roof up on a clear, blue, sunshiny day. When you look up at the space above this room now, the difference between that space in the blue sky above compared to the confined 4 walls and roof space, that difference would be remarkable, wouldn't it?
Absolutely.
Well, this is what I started to notice as I was sitting there, full of human anger and ill will towards this event. I just started noticing this larger part of my consciousness opening up. And I'd never experienced anything like it before. It was incredibly peaceful, and I started to feel an incredible sense of being loved. And when I say loved, Daniel, I'm not talking about the exchange of human love that I'd had as a child and as an adult. You know, I had a loving family, I had loving friends, I had, loving relationships with my girlfriends. It wasn't that kind of love. This felt like a love that was literally surrounding me and pressing in on me. And when I was questioned about it, I used the term oceanic on purpose, because it felt like if you picked somebody up and dropped them into the middle of a big ocean of water, that ocean of water would be pressing in on that person, yes, with water pressure. It literally felt like I was in this ocean of love that was just pressing in on me. And to my amazement, while I'm feeling this incredible sense of being loved, I started to notice that all of the pain, the inflammation, the stiffness, the disabilities that I had brought with me to this lecture, it was starting to soften and loosen and started literally evaporating before my very eyes. Quite literally.
You know, what you said earlier, what was it when you said that you were at this event, it was a Christian sort of event, that you didn't want to be there? Was it just something about the Christianity perhaps itself that kind of made you think, what am I doing here?
Well, what it was, because of that experience as a child, because these people that had been so, rough and brutal to me, because they called themselves Christians, I just thought all Christians were bad. I had no idea there were really lovely Christians all over the place. But because of that childhood experience, I just assumed that if somebody was a Christian, I shouldn't trust them. So when the lecturer started talking about this lecture as being based on the healing message of God's great love as found in the Bible, I just didn't want to be there. I just thought, oh my goodness, they're Christians. And I've tried every Christian church. I've asked them all to pray for me, and nothing has helped. What did these people think they've got that the other churches didn't have? I was just really, I was just really deflated. And then I felt a bit angry. I wasn't happy that I felt like I'd been, in some way tricked into something I wouldn't have normally gone to. I wouldn't have gone to a Christian lecture. I wouldn't have gone to any more Christian churches. I thought I'd tried them all. But what I realized after the lecture is I'd never come to a Christian Science church. That seems to be the difference.
I thought it would be interesting to ask that question because it seems that if you get in conversations with people and Christianity comes up, you kind of see or sense that kind of shudder. Like,
Yes.
What has this particular religion done over the years that's made people go, beat it? They're made fun of a lot, actually. However, I found that over the years that somehow I call it accidental, if you will, I don't know, but that I had found Christian Science through things that I was learning about, and I was like, well, this is awfully different, and it really was, and I actually found it beautiful, and I thought, okay, so, the biggest stretch of the imagination that I could have is when you think about the life of Jesus Christ, for instance. Most of the time, what you see is a guy hanging on a cross and a bunch of self-righteous people saying, well, he died for my sins. Okay, well, that's fine, but, what about the rest of his life? And what did this guy run around doing? And you discover, as you actually read directly in the Bible from time to time, or even in Christian Science, well, what he was trying to say is, look, you're all capable of miracles. In fact, I believe a direct quote from the Bible, greater things than I you shall do.
Exactly.
And what's funny about that is there was a young girl that I worked with many years ago, and she was what you might call one of them invested hardcore Christians. And I actually would talk to her about this, and she would always nod her head, no, I was always wrong about everything I said. And I'm like, it's in the Bible. What Bible are you studying here? And, when you think about your experience, for instance, Do you think that this experience that you had was just kind of one of them one-off things for you, or do you think others can experience something similar in their lives?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do get asked this. And, the way that I understand it now, I realize that it cannot be just a one-off experience. Otherwise, it couldn't be called science. Because the reason why Mrs. Eddy used that phrase, Christian and science, that's what she called it, was because she felt that she discovered that those same healing laws, the spirit of life, truth, and love, that animated Christ Jesus in all of his healing ministry, she felt that she discovered that those same laws were still available, even though they'd been forgotten for about 1900 years. And if they're a law, that law must be unconditional. A little bit like the radio waves that we are using in this program and in your productions. These radio waves are based on laws of physics. And those laws of physics mean that while I'm in my office here in St. Louis, if I don't switch my radio on, it doesn't mean that the radio broadcast from the local city is not coming into my house. Actually, those radio waves are passing through every brick and beam of my building. But because I haven't tuned into it, it can seem like those radio waves are absent, can't it? Well, those radio waves, they don't care whether I'm young or old, male or female, rich or poor. Those radio waves just pass effortlessly through the entire building, completely and unconditionally. What I discovered in the days and weeks after this lecture was that all of Mrs. Eddy's writings were based on what she'd already discovered was in the Bible. So she was taking Bible promises, Bible laws, and Bible examples and practicing them to the best of her ability, and the result was she was having rapid healings of all kinds of illnesses and injuries for all kinds of people. So she realized that there must be this scientific principle or a law, if you like, behind it. And that's why she was able to replicate it. And because if you look at the modern day description of what is classed as a science, it basically has to pass three basic tests. First of all, it must be discoverable. Then it must be demonstrable so that people can examine it for themselves. And then when those circumstances are replicated in a different time and place, it should be repeatable. So that's the basic test that any body of scientific knowledge will have to go through before it's taken seriously. Well, Christ Jesus was demonstrating that there is a discoverable law of Christly love, this life, truth, and love that God is described as in the Bible. Jesus was able to bring that law into effect on countless occasions during his healing ministry. Mrs. Eddy discovered in 1866 that those same laws that Jesus promised would remain with us. Jesus did say, all of these things I've done, you shall do and more, yes? And he did say, I will pray the Father that he will give you a comforter, and that comforter will stay with you throughout all time. So when Mrs. Eddy discovered these laws in 1866, she wasn't inventing anything. She wasn't imagining anything. She was literally transformed in a healing experience quite similar to those gospel accounts of healings when people came in contact with Christ Jesus. She had a sudden change of situation in 1866. She recognized that it was based on this tremendous sense of love that she knew could only have come from God, and she researched the Bible deeply for the next 3 years before she started writing about it in her book called Science and Health, with key to those scriptures by Mary Baker Eddy. So that's why I don't think it's a one-off event, Daniel. I think if you understand the laws of radio, and you are living in a silent house, you understand the laws of radio, you use your equipment called a handheld radio or one on the kitchen counter, you simply switch it on and tune in, don't you? And then those radio waves appear loud and proud. Well, what Mrs. Eddy was trying to teach is the basis of Christian science is praying to understand God aright. And what she did was she introduced a phrase which hadn't been mentioned before her time, she was talking about the difference between the 5 physical senses and what she coined the phrase was spiritual sense. Now, spiritual sense is something that's higher than the 5 physical senses because, for instance, the 5 physical senses do not tell me that there are radio waves passing through my office right now. And yet, if I switched my radio on, I could bring it to the microphone here and you could hear the radio waves here. But my 5 physical senses are not conscious of it. I need something slightly higher to tune into it called the handheld radio. Mrs. Eddy was basing her teachings of Christian Science on what she called spiritual sense, which is basically the promise from the Bible called the Christ in you, your hope of glory. This is a law of God which has been promised for each and every individual. These laws, we are told in Hebrews, he wrote these laws. God said, I will write my laws. In your hearts and in your minds will I write them. So God has promised that we have these spiritual laws already contained within, and that this Christ in us is the way that we can access these spiritual laws, the way that Jesus prayed, which was to go into the closet. In other words, quieten the 5 physical senses and tune in to what spiritual sense may be telling you. So it's a little bit like the radio waves in that example, if that makes sense, Daniel.
Well, it does, and in fact, just to lend some clarity, so what you suggest is that as people want to pray, let's say, what you're really saying is, at least in Christ's way, is that you just want to be still, be quiet, and be alone so you can listen. It isn't necessarily that you're saying, oh, please, Jesus, help me out of this bind that I'm in. Most of the time it seems people are usually in prayer when they're suffering instead of maybe being in gratitude when they're suffering, going, okay, what's the special lesson I'm supposed to take from this kind of a thing here?
And I tried all those prayers myself as well.
And I find it fascinating about when you read Christian Science. There was a good year that I spent just reading and realizing, well, this is some really cool, for lack of a better word, self-help stuff, and that is, like you said, the idea of science behind it being replicatable. It isn't something that just happens to a select group of goody-goodies, but this can happen for everybody. It's just a matter of simply, understanding, I guess, the rules, if you will. And you don't even have to be Christian. That's the one thing that I remember. It's about Christian Science. It isn't about being Christian. And it was really, I think, one of the most remarkable things that really changed my mindset is, as I was reading this, I realized there was also be careful with your word. Even Don Miguel Ruiz talks about this in the 4 Truths, that be careful, be impeccable with your word. That meaning be careful because, for instance, how a lot of people, most of the time, they can't tell you what they want, but they can certainly tell you what they don't want. And when you apply it in this realm that we're in today with Christian Science, it says the same thing. Be careful about what you don't want, because in science, in quantum physics, it proves that your thought continuously will eventually manifest the reality that you don't want to have in your life, because the mind doesn't know that there's no such thing as I don't want. It only hears I want. And that's what changed me. Is like, oh, I better start being careful with what my thoughts are, for instance, because you might think, well, I hate this job. I really don't want to be working here. And then in time you're surprised because you get fired.
We have a saying where I come from in Wales. We say, be careful what you wish for because it may just happen.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So
absolutely.
We tend to watch our thinking. Wales is quite a traditional society that I grew up in. Very traditional kind of orthodox Christian beliefs, where, they believe in good and evil, and you get punished if you do the wrong thing, and you get rewarded if you do the right thing. And that basically means, it's not unconditional. And what I've realized when I first started studying Christian Science, they make a very clear distinction between mind with a small m, which is basically referring to our mortal minds, and mind with a capital M, which is referring to divine mind. So when you look at the difference then between what a mortal mind may think, and you compare and contrast that to what divine mind might be thinking, there's often a huge difference between the two. And this became clear to me when I started studying what they call the weekly Bible lesson at the local church. And remember, I'm a complete atheist, right? I know nothing about the Bible. I've never been interested in it before. I come to an incredible event, a lecture which completely transforms me. I've got a lot of questions for this little church. I was really skeptical, you know.
Sure.
How do they keep this stuff off the streets? Why is not everybody talking about this? So
I know, isn't it surprising when you discover this? And I was the same way, you know, about Christian Science, you know. And I don't go to church, you know, like you, and there were Eastern philosophies that I've studied over many years, and I came, you might say, I like to say, through the back door of this, and I'm like, well, wait a minute, how come they're not teaching this at Christian churches if they're supposedly Christian? This is Christian Science. But then I realized this could be for anybody. It really doesn't matter what you want to see. You could be Buddhist or Hindu for all they care, but these laws are applicable, you know, even in those. You can be an atheist. It's still the same thing, you know. You just follow the laws, as you said, in science. You know, you get a piece of wood hot enough, it's going to burn.
Yeah. These are laws that don't change, yes? And what I was realizing when I understood what mind with a capital M does compared to mind with a small m, it illustrated what happened to me on the night of the lecture. Because on the night of the lecture, my human mind was not happy at all with what was going on at that event, but this larger sense of consciousness, what you might call divine mind, impressed me more with the qualities of God, which is one of the qualities God's described as in the Bible, is love. I felt an unearthly sense of being loved, unlike any love I'd have ever experienced before in my life. And that was a part of the quality of divine mind appearing for me. Now, as I studied further, I started to notice there were other terms that describe the qualities of God, you know, like life and truth and love. These qualities are names for God mentioned throughout the Bible that we can learn to deepen our understanding of according to what divine science says about thinking rather than what my human reactions may say about thinking. Because I may judge people, you know, I may be on the highway and somebody cuts across me dangerously, the thought may come to me, oh, look at that silly driver. But if I were to ask God what does he see in that moment, what would God say? Something more like, well, that's my beloved son in whom I'm well pleased. Now, if I have that thought and hold that thought about what seemed to be a dangerous driving maneuver, and I think to myself, oh, this is God's beloved son in whom God is well pleased, that lack of anger and ill will towards the driving may actually be the forgiving act that person needed to feel that morning so that they do drive safe for the rest of that day. Whereas if I start honking the horn and driving up his tailgate, you know, that may make that guy still be an anxious driver, you know, 10 minutes down the line. So I was realizing that we have this ready resource everywhere we go. Instead of listening to what the material senses are saying, because, you know, when a dangerous driving maneuver happens, my body tenses up just like anybody else. You know, I'm ready to hit the brakes. But I've learned to practice praying now in a way that I can listen to what spiritual sense is saying, even when my physical senses are tense or nervous or fearful. I can still practice listening to what the Christ in me, Christ in you, the hope of glory. This is what Jesus was demonstrating. It's what was promised. And it says, you know, 1 Corinthians says, we have the mind of Christ. You know, we have access to this Christly thought. And I've learned to practice that more often than less often. And it's not surprising to me that things have just got better and better in every avenue of my life, even driving on the freeway, I must say.
You know, and you're right about that. I realized, you know, as I was back in the day reading in Christian Science that, well, if I have to be careful with my words, then what are my thoughts doing? And I noticed, for instance, as you were talking about a driver cutting you off, that somebody may say something or do something and you experience it through a particular filter other than the reality that it actually is. And what I would find is I would hear that chatter in my head, all of a sudden saying, well, this son of a gun is doing this because of this, and this, and here we go, the reactionary stage. And as I began putting my thinking in check, like, for instance, if I'd have that thought rise, well, this person's doing this, to conspire against me, then all of a sudden I'd have a voice question that, say, well, what evidence do you have that that's true? And pretty soon, as you were saying, it becomes more of a habit. That's the unique thing is now I catch my thinking, and sometimes I smile and I'm rather entertained by some of the junk that I think at times. That doesn't mean all the time. There's still those reactive times, but that's just it. It's a lifetime of practice.
It is, and it is definitely a practice, you're right. And the more you practice, is it any surprise that you get better at it? I don't think it is. So Mrs. Eddy calls everybody that studies Christian Science a student of divine science, so that we're all there to learn and practice the next best step. So we're ready to grow and change if we have better information or better inspiration, but she's expecting us all to keep progressing in this understanding of our personal relationship with God, because that's how he made us. In First Genesis, he said, I made you in my image and likeness. So to me, it's key to know as much as I can about God's qualities, to know, therefore, what his reflection looks like, which is me and you and every other child, man, woman on the planet, We're all made in his image and likeness. So instead of trying to work out what I can do or what I think is important, I try to focus on what do I know to be true about God? What do I know to be important aspects of divine life, truth, and love? And then I'll try to reflect those effortlessly, like a mirrored image. If I lift a 50-pound weight in front of the mirror, my reflection effortlessly, simultaneously lifts that same weight, doesn't it? The original is doing all the work in front of the mirror, but the image and likeness can just do it effortlessly, can't it? So what we focus on as much as we can in our daily Bible studies as Christian scientists, we try to learn and imbibe as much as we can about the qualities of God, and then learn to reflect those effortlessly in our daily interactions with the world.
I'm sure the people who are going to attend your lecture, which I know is coming up soon, we can go ahead and have you give us a little bit of detail about when that happens, are going to be pretty astounded. And hopefully it'll be certain people in the audience that, like you, were feeling like, well, I'm here, but what am I doing here? And I think they'll be in for, a real treat, actually, as far as that goes, especially from what you've shared with our listeners here today.
Well, all I can say, Daniel, is when I came to that lecture, there was no element of faith in Christianity in my thought. So it wasn't because I believed Christianity would help me, and therefore that belief brought about a special transformation in my life, because there was no belief in anything beneficial from a Christian church up until that point, okay? There was no sense in me that I was going to an event that could possibly change my life. But just like when my physics teacher explained how the laws of radio waves worked, it completely changed my understanding about the nature of physical reality, because he demonstrated to me not only were those radio waves passing through the classroom, but you know what he did next? He put his fist over the antenna of the radio. And when he put his fist over the antenna, the radio still played loud and proud. And he said to me, do you know what this means? He said, those radio waves are passing through every single fiber of your body, and your 5 physical senses are not conscious of it at all, he said. It's passing through effortlessly. But it passes through everybody, he said, unconditionally. So what I learned from that experience at the first Christian Science lecture I attended is that the laws that are promised in the Bible, and there are many of them, Mrs. Eddy discovered that they were available. She collated them after 3 years of deep scriptural study to get the first edition of Science and Health, the Key to the Scriptures, off the press. Then she was sharing these laws in a way that she could practice it and demonstrate it so that others could learn to practice and demonstrate for themselves. So I came away from that lecture really keen to find out more about these laws, and they were completely unconditional, just like the radio waves. So if anybody has any doubts about where they stand with it could be a physical challenge, it could be relationship issues, it could be finances, it could be employment, it could be looking for a new home or needing a home, whatever seems to be causing that person any sense of suffering or any sense of hardship, if they come to understand that they're within this broadcast, if you like, the radio wave broadcast is the analogy I'm using, if they could imagine that they're in this broadcast of the laws of life and truth and love, just like me, before the lecture, I didn't know how to tune into those laws, so they seemed to be absent from my life. But from the night of the lecture, when I started to learn how to pray in Christian Science, which means quietening the five physical senses, tuning into what spiritual sense is saying, that spiritual sense is the Christ in you, your hope of glory. It's the laws of God written in our hearts and our minds. When I learned to tune into it on that night, from then on, I knew how to consciously become aware of it, just like when radio waves were demonstrated to me by the physics teacher. From that day on, I knew how to tune into radio waves. It became that logical to me. Honestly, Daniel, I'm not kidding, because I was a very logical, kind of methodical, mechanical kind of guy. So I had to look at it from a very, a dispassionate point of view. And the more that I looked at it, the more that I examined it, the more I could see there was a divine logic behind all of these laws, and that they are unconditional and ever-present. So this became a thrill for me, and I'm hoping that anybody coming to the lecture in the coming weeks with any type of challenge that seems to be discordant or causing them suffering, hopefully they will come and hear the same message, but they can practice this for themselves, there and then. Now, the first venue I'm coming to, up in Oregon, it's called Beaverton. It's on Tuesday, March the 3rd, at 7 p.m. It's at 5550. So that's 5550 Southwest Hall Boulevard in Beaverton. Then, 2 days later, on Thursday the 5th of March, I'm going to be in Portland. And the address for that is 710 Southwest Jackson Street, Portland. That's Thursday, March the 5th at 7:15 p.m. Then, on Friday at 7 p.m., Friday the 6th at 7 p.m., I'm going to be going even into the local prisons. I'm going in to share this message with the guys that at the moment find themselves incarcerated. So this is what's going on in that region in the coming days.
And for the listeners out there, if you want to find out more about these lecture series, you can go to pdxcslectureseries.com to discover more. Philip, I want to thank you for joining us here on the program today and letting our listeners know about this message here. It's been a real pleasure to have you on the program today.
Thank you so much, Daniel. It's been really great talking to you as well. Best wishes with all you do.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for joining us. You can discover more at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We do encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter. Keep up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50 as well as our upcoming shows. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. And remember,